Okay, the next topic which I would like to get onto in my defence of the phrase technofascism, indeed in my support of the phrase technofascism, is to talk about the sociological aspect of fascism, which is more or less ubiquitous fear. Now, there have obviously been so many good books and documentaries and discussions of this very deep and very broad subject. But one part that I'd like to single out to talk about is what I think is our very modern fear, which we sometimes call FOMO, fear of missing out. And this is connected to many things, to vanity and insecurity, to our intrinsic need to feel a sense of belonging to a group, and so on. I'd just like to say that there is an absolutely wonderful book on this subject. And it's not one that I'm going to recommend because I would say for the average reader it's a difficult and complex psychoanalytical text. But it's by a guy called Adam Phillips, and the title of the book is Missing Out, subtitled In Praise of the Unlived Life. And I have to say that for me it was absolutely massively influential. I was fortunate enough to read it at a time, perhaps 10 years ago now, that gave me enormous courage to follow my path, to trust my decisions, in never getting involved in social media, in never creating a Facebook account, in never signing up for any Google accounts, for staying the hell away from things like Twitter. And partly that's because I'd already got that out of my system in the mid-1990s, and being part of a different wave of technological culture. I spent thousands of hours in internet relay chat on the NNTP news network, in gaming servers and so on. So when the popular side of social media, like Facebook, turned up, it already seemed very old hat to me. But from the turn of the century and certainly the past 15 years, I would say, for those who've stayed outside of social media, it's always felt like there is an enormous social, pressure, but almost a screaming demand, an accusatory stigmatization and distrust of people like myself who just don't want any part of that kind of thing. And I found Adam Phillips' analysis of what makes us fear missing out to be enormously empowering. Anyway, let's quickly mention some of the qualities of this. I pause to call it a psychopathology, but it's certainly a human weakness. It goes along with many aspects of what I previously referred to as the Apollonian. And that's an archetype that's very strong in all of us today. It's a desire for totality and a desire for certainty in things. Certainty is something that's just not possible. And in the same way that Eve Ensler said, the quest for security is just not possible. So many of us are engaged in these fool's errands. Ideas like total information awareness, as if such a thing could even be possible. It's these aspects of the Apollonian mindset, I think, as a scientist and as a humanist, which bring out the very dark side of science. They bring out the worst in technology, an almost fanatical tendency towards reductionism, a need to control everything, the need to tag and track and measure and account for everything, to account for all people and their thoughts and feelings and whereabouts and ideas and associations. I would say it's the mark of a profoundly insecure mind. And if we were talking about individuals, I think there'd be a temptation to label that as some kind of a fault, perhaps even a psychopathology or personality disorder if you were inclined to such labelling. But this fear, I think, more than anything else today, is what is being leveraged to get us to engage with technologies that we don't really need. That there might be some vital piece of information that we don't have, or some unmissable opportunity which if we only had the right smartphone application we'd know about. And I know these words will be meaningless to those of you who are deeply addicted to smartphones and smart things of all kinds, but I hope you can hear me when I say, as a computer scientist, as someone whose life is enmeshed in code every day, in building and debugging systems, in working with the very latest technologies, with machine learning and neural networks, all aspects of digital signal processing and so on, that there is absolutely nothing missing in my life for not having a smartphone. The mental freedom that it gives me, the necessary separation and headspace. Well, okay, disclosure. This is my way of controlling my digital world. That irony is not lost on me. But I guess the point is, I do control it. I make a very difficult and conscious choice not to have a smartphone in my life, not to allow those aspects of social media in, so that there's more time for me to think about what I think are important things. And when I hear other people say that they couldn't possibly live without their smartphone, that they feel existential dread at being disconnected from Facebook and Twitter, that they could not imagine a world without Google and Amazon, I know in my heart that I'm hearing the voice of every heroin addict and alcoholic I've ever met in my life. Guys, I'm no stranger to addiction and to seeing people's lives fall apart. And the parallels that I see between behaviours with technology and behaviours with substances are heartbreaking to me. So really, the idea that you might be missing out in some way, I find it hard to take that seriously. And yet this fear remains very prevalent in our society. I don't see it diminishing as much as I hoped it would, at least not in the last 5 years maybe. And I feel sad to admit that I think the COVID-19 virus crisis we're going through now and in the future will actually make this unfounded fear much worse. But to bring it back onto track, I think this fear is something that the tech giants are deeply aware of and employ cynically and strategically to hook people and keep people on their wares. I'd like to talk about another aspect of fascism, which may seem incongruous if you take the fascist project to be wholly directed by an Apollonian appetite for reason. And that is that in history, fascist movements are almost always characterized by elements of mysticism, symbolism, and the occult. I'm sure there are many brilliant philosophers and psychologists whose work I'm completely unaware of that understand this connection and know why, but I'm not well read on the Jungian side of these things. But Hitler, for example, and the Nazi regime were absolutely enchanted by astrology. And when you look at the symbolism, the semiotics, the governing themes in these insane movements, it's quasi-religious symbolism very strong there. I said earlier that in some senses corporate logos can stand in for uniforms and flags. And I don't think it's any kind of a stretch to talk about a company and products like Apple as being part of a cult movement. People don't buy Apple computers because they know anything about computers. It's one of the most incredibly successful triumphs of a symbol, of brand, of the Apple as a lifestyle symbol and something to have allegiance towards. And we don't have to pick on specific companies or products. Just think of the meaning of the cloud, for example. What is the cloud? Where did that come from? Well, there's this vernacular story that network engineers will tell you of how we used to draw pictures of the internet in diagrams, and somewhere in the middle there would be this kind of fuzzy bubble that looked a little bit like a cloud, basically shorthand for drawing an internet. And somehow, because of that, distributed networks and distributed storage systems got this label of the cloud. Well, yeah, but honestly, there's more to it than that. Words have to be picked up in order to gain common usage and currency. They need to be adopted and pushed by the right people. And the cloud, if you think about it, is loaded with a lot more meaning. It's much more than a nebulous network of distributed computers. It's a thing that floats in the sky. It's a thing that might have choirs of angels with harps on it. It's a thing that the sun shines through, that might have a silver lining. And most of all, it's fluffy and it's white. And perhaps what we don't think of when we think of the cloud is tempests and thunderbolts, but maybe we should. And the occult element of modern tech fascism, and I'm certainly not the first to go here with this comment, it's located very much in Californian Silicon Valley, with movements that identify themselves as transhumanists, who are waiting for the singularity so that they can all be uploaded to the cloud, where they will no doubt enjoy immortality floating in space forever as part of some kind of everlasting Facebook party. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to take seriously, but you can trace many influences to this. Certainly some Russian science fiction writers and other mystical thinkers. But to me, I mean, maybe it's because I'm British, I don't know, but I find the whole thing deeply unhinged, narcissistic and small-minded. And if they were just a bunch of people living on a hill who were all going to go and drink Kool-Aid, it wouldn't be a problem. The problem is that some of these people are leading some of the most important and powerful companies and organisations in the world right now. And their ideas are deeply, deeply suspect. And from what I can see, largely unchallenged. We are so enamoured with the technology that Silicon Valley produces. We're such cargo cultists ourselves, and these shiny hand-me-downs, that we don't really question the minds behind them and what is the project that they're really a part of. Let's put aside for a moment that the internet was originally developed as a military project for robust long-range communications, and think about its impact on economics and politics from the mid-1980s forwards. When I was at school in the 1980s, it was common to hear about the information economy, and then later in the early 90s about the information superhighway. But while politicians had a lot to say about this, and governments embarked on funding large projects of digital literacy, I don't think at the time that anybody really had any idea what an information economy was or might be. We kind of had this naive notion that somehow by us all becoming producers and consumers of information, an entire economy could exist independently of the production of goods and services. And what actually happened is in many ways paradoxical and goes to the heart of a great contradiction in the idea of the internet itself. That contradiction is that the free flow of information, rather than generating wealth for established interests, actually subtracted from it. And in order for existing economies to continue to work, it was necessary to put the brakes on the free flow of information, to create artificial information scarcity, and to control and regulate the flow of information. This, of course, came about by a massive expansion in the meaning and scope of so-called intellectual property, and in more recent years has led to a rise in censorship and problematic concepts such as those of hate speech. But overall, the volume of and opportunity to share information for most of us has increased unimaginably. However, the cost of that has been an enormous change in understanding the meaning of the word free when we talk about free information flow. The idea that allowing unfettered global peer-to-peer communication would somehow magically create value and boost economies turned out to be a large mistake for established power. And that battle to keep the initial taste that many of us growing up got of a free internet is an ongoing and bitter struggle sometimes. There is a concerted effort, an enormously well-funded project to wind back the initial peer relations of the internet and to restructure it into a hierarchical, tightly controlled topology with choke points, ubiquitous surveillance and monitoring, monetization, and a return to a dissemination or asymmetric broadcast model, much more like television and radio were. So I would suggest that this project to reverse the initial human value of the internet as a cultural and scientific tool of free exchange is part of the definition of technofascism. We've already touched on some of the causes of technofascism, and in most cases they're nothing more than the existent battles taking place between various parts of society, but amplified in some way by technology. And so one way of looking at this is that, in a way, technofascism doesn't really have a cause. What I mean by that is that these struggles are, if you like, an endemic, an intrinsic or immanent part of how society functions. So there is no essential cause to technofascism. We can suppose that a civilization, a good civilization, one that's worth living in, is something that requires constant maintenance, a constant gardening, a constant vigilance against decay towards tyranny. As the famous Lincoln quote goes, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for a few good people to do nothing. Viewed this way, the rise of technofascism is really just the fall of our concern and care for the upkeep of our liberal society. It's a decay that comes about through too much convenience, through things being too easy, such that we lose sight of the value of freedom, and we forget the enormous cost of fighting fascism and tyranny. The story that we tell ourselves about the British involvement in the Second World War and Winston Churchill's representation of the will of the British people is somehow encapsulated in the word never. Never to accept fascism and to fight to the last drop of blood is in some ways the slogan that epitomises the British spirit in the 1930s. But today, that courage seems a far and distant memory. Most people, it seems, tremble at the thought of mere economic disadvantage or losing their job. The terms speaking out and whistleblowing have come to take the place of simple honesty, and even mild criticism is frowned upon in the corporate workplace. People are afraid that their social media posts might not be liked, or that they might be defriended for voicing the wrong opinion. In consequence, people seem to cling together in cliques of mutually stroking and self-reinforcing groups, leading to ever more isolated silos and disconnection from the rest of the world. It's this fragmentation into many groups, all in mutual fear of each other's disapproval, that creates an amazing social control mechanism. Divided and discoordinated, people have no common voice and no ability to build common values, let alone the courage to fight an oppressor. Another contribution to the rise of anti-humanist technologies is, I think, a decline in the ethics applied to research. This is something I have first-hand experience of in connection with academia and universities. People who work in universities will say, "Come on, Andy, you've got this completely arse backwards." In fact, the problem is that ethics panels in universities are far too bureaucratic and stop almost all good research from happening. And I agree, and think that that is just one symptom of an underlying problem. The problem is that most university ethics procedures are a total and absolute sham, and that's something that's very easy to verify, just by asking any group of people who are on university ethics boards what qualifications and education they have in ethics. The answer, invariably, is absolutely none. Ethics is a deep and difficult branch of philosophy. In the very best case, I think it would take at least 5 years to study even an outline of ethics. And almost nowhere on a university ethics board will you find someone who can separate a utilitarian argument from a Kantian postulate on the good. Most of us assume that we osmose the principles of ethics just through ordinary lived life. And more dangerously, that expertise in a particular subject area, say biology or technology, leads one to have an intrinsically good idea of ethics of that subject. But the point is moot because, in reality, those who sit on ethics boards have absolutely no time at all for reflection. Faced with 100 research proposals and half a morning to get through them, the only way that ethics can possibly be conducted in universities is by a tick-box, rubber-stamping simulation of ethical consideration based on the occurrence of keywords like children or animals or any mention of disability. In reality, what decides whether a research proposal is approved or not is the ties that the university has in terms of technology transfer and research grants to very large corporations. What this means is that ethics committees are bureaucratic juggernauts that will weed out any research proposals which are novel, interesting, and like all good research involve some element of risk, in favour of those that are simple, fit the profile for journal impact factors, and please the corporate moneylenders. And so, in reality, many dangerous and insidious projects are approved. Anybody who has had to teach a research method seminar at university will have taught a module on ethics. And if you have any philosophical inclination, if you're interested in the philosophy of science, then it's an absolutely heartbreaking exercise to do. A modern corporate interpretation of ethics is absolutely one-dimensional. It's really about public relations and not looking bad in the eyes of the press. Another problem comes from the ideas of research students themselves. As tenure has been eroded and the good professors have been driven from academia in favour of 0 hours contract associate lecturers and visiting professors, there's a troubling shortage of mature, well-considered guidance for young people. Many masters and PhD students in their early 20s or 30s consider technology to be a playground, one where any device or data set can be connected to any other, just for the fun of it. And indeed, that is a legitimate part of the pioneering and innovative nature of computer technology. But rarely are young people given a most important piece of advice, which is, just because you can, doesn't mean you should. It's a maxim which, if heeded, would never allow any university computer science department to work on, say, facial recognition, for it seems obvious to anyone with the most basic grounding in political theory and ethics that it's the good, advantageous cases which are marginal, and that the vast majority of applications serve tyranny. Now, I'm not saying that it's ever clear at all what the unintended consequences and side effects of any research project might be. But it's very clear to me that many young people find themselves enrolled on PhD or research programs without ever having been invited to make such a deep personal inquiry and figure out whether or not they think doing such a thing is right or not. Over the years, I've lost count of the number of Silicon Valley adventurers and tech startup entrepreneurs who have described themselves to me as amoral business people. And I've never known quite how to respond to that. I think I've never had the heart to say straight to their faces that outside of philosophical textbooks, there's no such thing as amorality, but there is only ambivalent disregard for others. But the problem of moral relativism within an interregnum has been with us, well, at least since Nietzsche's transvaluation. And it's a problem that just doesn't seem to get any better. It's growing and growing in the 21st century. I don't personally blame that on secularization. I've known many secular humanists who are deeply moral, who are extraordinarily compassionate and generous people, for whom the absence of a God has no impact on their human generosity and consideration for others. But I do think that the lack of boundaries within some permissive Western cultures, and particularly West Coast American cultures, has produced an entitled generation. A generation that sees itself as the centre of the digital universe, one where the individual entrepreneur has some kind of absolute right to treat it as their personal playground. And I can kind of get that and respect the frontier spirit. It's very noble, it's very American, it's fine so long as you consider all indigenous and other interests to be disposable or something you can sacrifice in your quest to build a new world. And that kind of comes out in documents like the Hacker Manifesto. That's something I've read many times with great interest and empathy. And the desire to reject the constraints and oppression of the old world and tradition that's a very powerful force indeed. But there is such a thing as the foolhardy adventurer. And the archetype of the reckless engineer, the mad scientist who blows himself up and everybody along with them, seems to be quite absent from that culture. It's a definite blind spot in the American tech entrepreneurs world. To be an agent of positive change in the world, one needs to be a leader. And it's hard to be a leader when one is completely dependent and in a state of prolonged childhood. But unfortunately, that is a state I feel that so many of us are forced to assume today. Not just in our actual dependence on electronic technologies to live, to shop, to vote, to find a partner, to book transport, to pay for things, and to find our way around the city. But there's a more fundamental kind of infantilization that's going on. And you can see that in the design of many applications, in fact. And it's one of the reasons I started a project, a course that I teach, which is called Computing for Grown-Ups. It's not something I'm going to go into now, but I think many of you will be kind of familiar with what I mean in terms of how many digital technologies dumb down our lives. But what accompanies this kind of regression is a feeling of unreality, a sense in which there are no real consequences to our decisions and actions, that everything has an undo button. And that can be nice. There can be some upsides to that. It's nice to feel that we're able to explore life without too much fear. But there can also be a sense in which we never really make choices because we don't fully understand what those choices are. What becomes is an unbearable lightness of non-being, of clicking a career option, and this week we'll be a doctor, and next week we'll be a truck driver, and maybe the week after that we'll be a professional musician, whatever. And a life like that leads us to a feeling of always being unvalidated, having an imposter syndrome. It's a life of unconnectedness, of low commitment, of shallow and casual interaction. And in many senses, I think it's a virtual life. And that's interesting because virtual reality as a concept is intruding more and more into our ordinary lived lives. It started out in recreation, in entertainments and games. And I think that virtual reality does have its place in some niche applications such as training or therapy. But on the whole, for it to supplant real lived life with all of its risks and tragedies is, it's a tragedy. But from a techno-fascist's point of view, it's an enormous win. You don't have to have watched the Matrix movie to really get the idea that containment of a docile population, or to have read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, to know that a soma or drug or technologically induced state of pleasure provides a means of almost absolute control. And during the early stages of the COVID-19 virus outbreak, I was really saddened to hear from so many people who said that they felt isolation in a single room with a computer was really no different than everyday life for them, that the lockdown really didn't bring any change to their lives. And having grown up in a world where people took the piss out of nerds like me for being insular and antisocial, it kind of really depressed me to find that we've all become that. That's everybody today. And having broken free of technological enslavement myself in my late 30s and really widened my horizons through literature and travel, something that gives a purpose to my hacking now, it does strike me that the docile state that I see so many young people in is a terrible waste of life. Okay, I'd now like to progress to an entirely different section. And in this section, I'd like to turn around and offer a critique against tech fascism as a term. I'd like to question its usefulness and see what objections can be brought to bear. So I'll start with what I think may be quite a good argument, actually, and I'm calling this the ambivalent world objection. And this objection rests on the assumption that, to put it very bluntly, nobody gives a fuck. You see, a word like technofascism would only have currency and meaning in a world where people objected to fascism. And if, as it sometimes seems, we are living in a world in which people are ever more greedily gobbling up every form of oppressive technological enslavement, then an expression like technofascism doesn't really have any value. And to say that nobody really cares about fascism is just another way of saying that nobody really cares about freedom. And that may be true in the sense that people today have a lot of freedom and really enjoy that freedom, but they don't value that freedom because they've never had to struggle to defend it. And of course, I'm reminded of the Thomas Jefferson quote that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And let's hope it's a very long time before any or all of us have to suffer that again. The next argument I'm going to raise against technofascism, I'm going to call the epistemological objection. And by that I mean that the word technofascism is useless because nobody can really have any useful knowledge of it. In other words, unless people get it, unless they understand it, it has no real currency. So let's contrast that with something that people do understand, let's say segregation, apartheid or slavery. These are things that people can relate to and they can fear. They have historical precedents. But it may be that technofascism really is a new thing. And as such, the forms of enslavement that it threatens are not things that we can easily grasp. Already, it's very difficult for people to understand how elaborate correlations of data, which they would have no normal cause to be suspicious about, can produce frightening possibilities for abuse and manipulation. But it could be that, writ large, this ignorance of the dangers brought about by some socio-technical configurations are so obscure and difficult for people to get that they never really see it coming until it's far too late. And even then, they don't fully understand that they have been enslaved. And of course, this is somewhat congruent with Plato's allegory of the cave and the theme in the Matrix movie. And of course, from that position, we can argue, well, what does it really matter if people are happy in their ignorant enslavement? What could they possibly have lost that they never really had? Another criticism of technofascism that I would like to offer is that of its focus, and that it is just too broad a term. By conflating a whole bunch of disparate and possibly unrelated concepts together, it acts as a deflationary and as a term that subtracts from intelligent debate. Now, earlier, of course, in advocating for the term, I had said that what we really needed was precisely that, was a very broad umbrella term within which to bring about a dialogue. But I'm now saying that perhaps that is precisely its weakness. The last attack that I want to make on technofascism is simply that it's wrong. Or rather, the things that I am trying to assert here on behalf of that word are wrong. And this, of course, is the fallibilist's concession. And I do truly believe that one should never take seriously an argument with anybody who is not prepared to admit, at least in principle, that they could be radically wrong about everything that they believe. So I'll offer up here a world in which the ideas of technofascism are just wrong. And in that world, mass surveillance combined with artificial intelligence, covert psychometric profiling, anticipatory justice, and a social control mechanism which leverages vanity and shame and fear would actually lead to the best of all possible worlds. And that it's only for the want of some Panglossian insight that fools like myself and other paranoid, unhinged conspiracy theorists rage against the inevitable progress of mankind to a wonderful utopia. But at some point, as I fight against sarcasm and cynicism, it gets harder and harder to describe such a world. The purveyors of our liberating technology would have to be of the purest heart, and our governments and law enforcement and intelligence services free from all corruption and self-interest. And of course, the technology itself would have to be infallible, never possibly making any mistakes. But nonetheless, let's offer up this fallibilist concession as an objection and say, you know what, maybe we just are really wrong about what's going on in the world, and it's all going to be okay. Let's have a section on references and links. None of this enchanting chatter would be much use if you couldn't go away and do some deeper reading and follow up some of these ideas, so I've put together a short collection here. One of the problems for me is that my installation of org mode doesn't play very nicely with bibtex at the moment, so I haven't created a full reference listing, but I've split them into a few simple categories. Let's start with psychology. The text by Adam Phillips that I mentioned earlier, called Missing Out, that was actually published 2013. I mentioned attachment theory, and the classic, well, in fact, the foundational text in that field is John Bowlby's A Secure Base. And I also mentioned Eve Ensler's work, and she's the author of Vagina Monologues, I expect you know, but she wrote also, I'm not sure if it's a stage script or an article, but she certainly read excerpts of it on a YouTube video. That's Insecure at Last. Okay, next up are references on politics. Aristotle needs no introduction. The two works by Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are Leviathan and Rousseau's, it's the second discourse on inequality, which I think kind of offers the alternative social contract. And a really good book for those of you who believe in government and believe in political process is Crick, a great work in defence of politics. I have a second section here on academic politics, which doesn't always tally with the real world. There are two great pieces there by the great leftist anarchist Noam Chomsky. Miseducation is brilliant in that, well, for one thing, Chomsky really attacks intellectuals and academics for their compliance and lack of courage in dealing with these matters. And manufacturing consent is one I expect you already know, which is on the influence industry. Okay, Benjamin Ginsberg's Fall of the Faculty, very important text on the demise of the university system, as is Wendy Brown's. Well, Undoing the Demos is actually a much broader text, but she is a professor of political science who has a lot to say about the university system and its lack of courage in tackling the important issues of the day. Okay, moving into some traditional tech critique. These three authors are ones that you should definitely know. Neil Postman's written many books, but the one that I cited earlier was Technopoly from 1993. Jacques Ellul, a famous tech critique. Probably The Technological Society is a good introduction to his work. And one of my favourites, which was recommended to me by Joe Deacon, which is Ivan Illich's Tools for Conviviality. Very important in understanding how to build communities and the essentially relational nature of human existence. Going a little bit more into my own territory with systems theory and modelling and so on, Dana Meadows, who I love Dana Meadows. Where to Intervene in a System and The Limits to Growth are just must read. And a more recent work that kind of follows in the footsteps of Meadows a bit, I think, is Kate Raworth's Donut Economics. That's been enjoying a bit of popularity lately. Now, in terms of addressing tech fascism directly, I did mention Edwin Black's IBM and the Holocaust. One that was recommended to me by my friend and colleague Daniel James is Friendly Fascism, which is by Bertram Gross, a veteran of the Carter administration. A chap whose writings I quite like is Timon Shep. I think I'm saying that right. He's written about what he calls social cooling. Social cooling being the chilling and inhibitory effect of surveillance and privacy invading technology. And in reference to what I was saying about violence in the name of copyright, that article there is by Lee, which was on SWAT teams enforcing copyright. Okay, coming right home to my field and computer science and security engineering, the mighty Bruce Schneier, he's written, two that I definitely recommend is Data and Goliath and Click Here to Kill Everybody. But honestly, the books aren't as good as the blog. He has a brilliant online resource, which is always filled with the latest analysis and stories that hackers absolutely love. And Bruce and some others kind of attempt a project which I think is very much aligned with anti-technofascism, which is broadly called technology in the public interest. To start drawing these arguments to an end, I hope the outline that I've given of what I think are the important qualities of fascism and the connections that I've made to practices and events within the current technology industry lends some credibility to the idea that we should take seriously the idea that there is a very real danger of fascist projects emerging from consumer technologies on the trajectory that we're currently travelling. I'd just like to mention a few pieces of evidence that point to that. In general, there is an ever closer connection of big tech and sensitive state functions. And by that, I mean things like census taking, which is often conducted by private data companies, and elections. At what point do we pass the threshold of what comedian Stuart Lee called Mr. Fox's Guide to Henhouse Security, where we let Facebook and Google run our elections? In Britain, we already allow, I've forgotten who the company is, it's Palantir or Northrop Grumman or one of these big data companies. They run our census. The British government do not conduct the census on the British people. So there's a fusing of state functions with big tech companies. And the latest one we're seeing, of course, is in the health sector. Another one is, of course, a very uncomfortable relationship between law enforcement, private detective agencies, private security firms and companies like Amazon and their Ring doorbell system, which deploys kind of ubiquitous surveillance at the street level, at the private property level, but can so easily be adapted to incorporate facial recognition and street-by-street tracking of individuals. We are in a situation, as Edward Snowden very clearly pointed out, in which our smartphones are simply always on surveillance and tracking devices. And if at this point you're not prepared to say, well, hold on, okay, maybe there's something to this tech fascism thing, it might be interesting to think about what has been a project towards the criminalization of civic difference over the last 15 years. An example of that is in copyright and intellectual property, which was always a civil matter, but which media and technology companies have lobbied and aggressively pushed to have moved into the criminal realm, to the point where I think it was about 2004 where the first shooting occurred. It was actually a street vendor selling DVDs. And there was a time around 2003 to 2005 where the RIAA, that's the Recording Industry Association of America, had really garnered so much power, so much influence, that it had its own kind of paramilitary wing. You know, you had guys in SWAT suits with batons and guns, busting down doors and shooting at people over some fucking music. You know, the saying goes, there's no McDonald's without McDonnell Douglas, but there's no Simon and Garfunkel without Heckler and Koch. It's a situation like, as I said, about business interests being congruent with the pre-Hobbesian idea of anarchic or feudalistic gangs, where an organisation like the RIAA can have an armed contingent. And obviously this is in America, where the militarization of the police is a bigger problem than most places on the planet. But you may face a day when you face real threat of physical violence for not having the right smartphone, or for walking past the wrong camera with the wrong look on your face. And it's not that this technology causes fascism, it's that it enables it, so long as we do nothing to stop that enabling function. And when you look over the last 10 years, just a decade ago, having a mobile phone was still a choice. We lived in a world where we thought that polite people still mind their own business. And in just 10 years, we've moved to a situation where we say, you know, people have no right to privacy, that privacy is dead, and that we should be suspicious of people who don't carry a phone. This profound fear of non-connection and non-conformity, of non-belonging, actually seems like something potentially far worse than the fascism that we've seen in the past, than communism. And the transformation of technology from tools to tyranny, that's what I mean by technofascism. And so, in summary, I think that this word is legitimate and important. It has utility. It's more than a cute and smart-assed phrase. And I think it's something that could be useful to us in challenging the trajectory that we're currently on, if only as a straw man for serious debaters and serious arguments for why what we're seeing is not technofascism.